Good evening. Welcome to the Bodhi Tree. We are grateful and honored that you are here this evening. So I just want to invite everybody to enjoy, to listen deeply, and thank you for being here. Let's give a warm welcome to Ruby Warrington.
Hi everybody. Thanks for that lovely intro, Stephen. Thanks everyone for coming out this evening. I'm so grateful to be hosted by Bodhi Tree, and this is such a beautiful space. I'm from London originally. I'm now living in New York. When I first moved to New York, I was so excited because the sun shone all the time. Like compared to London, it was like constant sunshine. I was just like in heaven. And we've had the worst spring. And I keep going like, this is not why I moved here. What's going on? So it's really nice to be getting some sunshine at last. What a gorgeous room. Anyway, yeah, like Stephen said, obviously Bodhi Tree is kind of the original, at least in my mind, I've always held it as like the original esoteric or New Age bookstore, right? It was the first bookstore to really put this kind of conversation about the New Age onto the map in a more of a sort of mainstream kind of accessible way. So what an honor to be here tonight talking about my book, which is the not New Age, but Now Age Guide to a High Vibe Life. The Now Age is a term that I coined when I first began thinking about creating my website, the Numinous. And really it speaks to, this kind of there are two parts to what I term the Now Age. Firstly, for anybody who studies astrology, and I'm guessing that might be quite a few people here, the New Age of the 1960s was obviously referencing the Age of Aquarius, which we've been transitioning into slowly, globally, over the past several hundred years, really, from the Age of Pisces. And the Age of Aquarius began sort of like rapidly coming in more in the 1960s, and with it, all of these practices that spoke to the nature and the kind of the tone of the Age of Aquarius, this idea of personal development, individuation, the idea of absorbing different sorts of information from different cultures. And we really began to transition much more rapidly and fully into the Age of Aquarius this millennium, this century. Some people say that 2012 was the kind of the real tipping point. But anyhow, the way I see it, the New Age of the 60s is now. It can't be new anymore. That was 40 years ago. So we're actually in the New Age now, hence Now Age. But obviously the hallmarks of this Age of Aquarius are rapid advances in technology, which we're seeing all around us. The dissemination of information among the masses, which we're seeing as a result of the technology that we now have access to. The toppling of hierarchical structures, which we're also seeing come to pass. And all of these developments mean that we have access to all of this information right now. Like everything is we're living in such an age of instant gratification that this is another reason I term what we're living through the Now Age. And actually when you think about the sort of pressures that actually this Now Age life puts on us as human beings whose bodies and brains and sensibilities haven't necessarily caught up with the rapid pace of change that we're living in, particularly with technology, these ancient spiritual practices that began really coming into popularity with the New Age become more and more relevant, not only relevant, but actually necessary to thriving and really kind of staying grounded and remembering who we are as human beings versus kind of all of this rapid change. So here we are in the Now Age, and my book is really a guide, I suppose, to many of the practices that I've just been talking about and many of the practices which I cover on the Numinous. But it's interesting, as much as it is a guide to, so it's a guide to what are these practices, astrology, tarot, what is shamanism, what's plant medicine, what is meditation, what is yoga, and why. It's the guide is written through the lens of my personal experiences of having embraced many of these practices and philosophies in my life. So it becomes more of a memoir too. And it's interesting, I've really been thinking about, is it a memoir? Is it self-help? Is it a guide? Is it a comedy in parts, and it's actually very difficult to categorize this book. And it's a conversation I've had with my publisher, and that we, see it popping up in these random categories on Amazon. But I actually quite love the fact that this book cannot really be put into a neat, tidy little box. Because part of the message, part of the bigger message that revealed itself in the writing of the book, is that actually all of these practices are about reminding us that each of us has a very individual expression of what might be called spirit or life force energy, or the energy that connects all of us. That each of us is sort of uncategorizable, as much as modern life would like to have us all fit in these neat and tidy boxes. Actually, that's not really possible. And that many of these practices are really about peeling back those layers to help us rediscover who we truly are underneath all of that, who we each are in our own unique, individual human category that can only really be inhabited by us. So the book came to be quite serendipitously, actually. I didn't plan to write a book at all. As Stephen said, my career, my background in London is in journalism, and I've worked for many magazines, newspapers over the years. My last job was at the Sunday Times Style magazine in the UK, which it represented the sort of apex of my ambitions as a journalist. Came with all of this kudos, all of these kind of freebies. Everyone wanted this job. I had got this job. I was really like, done it. And a couple of years in, maybe even shorter than that, I became aware of this little voice of dissatisfaction that was just like, and? So you've done this, and now what? And I was kind of like, okay, this isn't good. Just keep doing this. Just keep doing this. This is everything I've ever wanted. Yeah, this is great. This is everything anyone ever wanted. So just keep doing this. And of course, you ignore that kind of a voice, and it tends to just get louder and louder and find ways to trip you up and maybe make you a little sick. And so I got to a point where I was actually suffering from extreme anxiety. I wasn't sleeping through the night. I was self-medicating with alcohol abuse. And it really wasn't great. So I began looking, I decided that I really needed, obviously, some kind of a passion project or something on the side that could just be mine, that could bring back the biggest and the most upsetting symptom of this existential crisis that I guess I was experiencing, was that I just had lost my sense of inspiration, really. I wasn't inspired about anything, and I was just kind of going through the motions of life. And it was very depressing at the age of, I was in my early 30s, to have felt that I'd reached a point so quickly in my career where I was just kind of, oh, that's it, I'm done. So I began looking around for a little side project, and I started doing some inner inquiry and was asking myself, well, if I was going to study anything, or if I could just kind of talk about anything at length and never get bored, what would it be? And I came upon astrology, which had always been a huge passion of mine, but not something I'd ever considered as a career. And so I decided to sort of dive into my astrological studies on the side and have a little kind of side thing going on, just a bit of a hobby, I suppose. I introduced myself to our resident astrologer at the Sunday Times, this amazing woman who's actually from LA originally. Her name's Shelley von Strunkel. And she's this kind of like, I describe her in the book as a grande dame of like mystical glamour, because she has traveled the world and studied all of the different mystical traditions in depth. And she took me under her wing and would invite me around to her apartment and feed me this biodynamic red wine and fill my head with these incredible stories of all of her different mystical adventures and discoveries. And she was the first person who ever used the word numinous in conversation with me. And as soon as I heard that word, I felt my whole body just come alive with tingles. And I saw it kind of on the cover of a magazine. And I just thought, wow, it really struck me that there was a huge gap in the market for a magazine or some kind of a publication or a platform that covered all these topics, which I found so fascinating, but in a way that made them more accessible and would actually bring them more into a sort of mainstream aesthetic that would appeal to my fashion editor friends, for example, all of whom, by the way, read Susan Miller's astrology every month, but would never confess to it or do it in public, because it was just kind of, oh, really? Eye rolls all around. So it really kind of, I decided there and then that I wanted to create this project, but didn't actually start working on it for another year or so, really, because I was so addicted. This woman in the front is like, really? I was so tied into this idea that this magazine job I'd fought so hard for was, that was success. Having landed this job, nailing this, having this high-powered thing was success. And what I was going to throw away, this thing I'd worked 15 years for, to start a blog about astrology, brain did not compute. But then my husband got a job in New York a few months later, and so I had to leave the job anyway, come to New York, and I started work on the Numinous. And it was a year or so after that a publisher at HarperCollins reached out and said, this is great. This is really cool. You've got a really different take on all of these subjects. Do you have a book proposal? And I didn't. So I ignored that email for a couple of months and got a book proposal together and went back to them. And 2.5 years later, here we are. So yes, I suppose part of my mission with the Numinous, as I said, was to really present all these different subjects in a way that would make people perhaps take them a little more seriously, would perhaps bring them out of the closet a little and more into mainstream consciousness. And if that was my mission with the Numinous, I suppose it's the mission with the book too, to really sort of demystify the mystical. And a lot of people who've been my early readers have the feedback has been like, wow, yes, the way you explain this makes it so obvious. Like, of course I would embrace this in my life. Of course I would try this because it just makes sense. And I'm so happy to have been getting that kind of feedback because I believe that the practices and tools described in this book, the practices and tools that Bodhi Tree have been promoting all of these years are, like I said in the beginning, not only relevant but absolutely necessary for our future thriving as a human race, really. So it's a bit of a big mission. It became a bit of a bigger mission than I ever intended. And in the writing of the book, which obviously involved embracing so many of these practices, which I was already, but even more so diving into my studies, and really it's packed full of interviews with many of the people who are really kind of leading the charge in bringing all of these New Age practices into the Now Age. I obviously... I underwent quite a personal transformation, shall we say, which became the backbone almost to the book. And so I'm going to read you a few excerpts which sort of talk about, which has the slightly, let's say, deeper dives, some of the deeper realizations, or speak to some of the deeper realizations I had about the huge importance of this subject at this moment in time, in history in particular. So this first little bit is from the intro, where I talk about exactly that, really, where I realized why this was such an important mission for me. So as I began to investigate all things numinous, it was as if every gong bath, every meditation, and every intuitive tarot session was clearing a path back to source, my higher self, the universal oneness, okay, God. And soon all the skeletons came screeching out of the closet, begging, in a kind of zombie apocalypse way at times, to be healed. Slaying them, or rather putting them to rest, R.I.P., has not always been pretty, but it has been consistently empowering, endlessly awe-inspiring, and often way more fun than another Friday night drinking my cares away. Because why would I want to wash away the things I care about? As we'll discover in the chapter on how, for me, healing is the new nightlife. Another word on the concepts of healing and wounds here too, since these are words you'll find me using a lot. Rather than be repelled by the idea that this suggests there's something wrong with you, how about leaning into the concept that there's actually something very, very right with you that needs healing, meaning bringing into wholeness in order for you to feel fully empowered? As for the people you may encounter who prefer to dismiss all things numinous as woo-woo bullshit or a bunch of silly girls getting squeamish over their Ouija boards, A, Screw the patriarchal systems that decided anything to do with divination and intuition has little bearing in the real world. And B, when not so long ago I was interviewed for British Vogue about the subject of astrology entering the mainstream, my response to a variation of the above objections went something along the lines of, the world is divided into scientists and mystics, those who mainly ask how and those who mainly ask why, left and right brain thinkers. I stand firmly in the latter camp, because for me, without this kind of existential self-inquiry, life is meaningless. Not that we don't need our fully functioning left brain faculties to navigate the daily task of being human, of course, but with no other word for God in my 5-year-old lexicon, I can also see now that even as a child, astrology spoke to a deeply human need in me, a need to know my place in the cosmos in order to feel connected to my highest self, to my fellow beings, and to the planet we happen to call home. I mentioned the G word there a couple of times. I grew up in a completely non-religious household, and so there wasn't ever any talk of any sort of higher power or any kind of inquiry really about what we might be connected to in a bigger sense. And so I do believe that astrology sort of became my religion when I discovered at about, I think, age 3, that I was born in the year of the dragon. And this lit such a fire in me. I was so excited by the idea that there might be this sort of like mystical dragon energy that I was somehow embodying. And I think that was really my first sort of inkling of an understanding of what this sort of mystical numinous force that ignites and enlivens all things could actually be, and that maybe I'd be able to channel it in some way. So there's a chapter in here on Dharma. I'm sure many people here are familiar with the concept of Dharma, but it's the chapter that most of my early readers would come back and say, wow, yeah, this really got me thinking about my life and about what I'm really doing with my time and where my energy is being spent. I want to find out what my Dharma is. I really want to discover my Dharma. And this has been so exciting to me because I think actually the chapter on Dharma and this idea of Dharma is really, again, it's kind of at the bottom. It's sort of underpinning all of the other work that kind of happens on top. Again, if we're thinking about all of these different tools and practices as ways to get back to, like I said in the beginning, who am I outside, beyond all of these boxes that society wants to put me in? Who am I really underneath all of that? Well, the next logical question then is, well, if this is me, then what am I here to bring to the world? You know, and I think one of the reasons this chapter has struck such a nerve, or a chord rather, with people is that we're living in times, very interesting times, shall we say, when I think many people are asking that question of themselves from a spiritual perspective or not, but really like, okay, let's take a look at the world. Things aren't really working. The systems that govern us, are not really supportive of the sort of future that we want to see in the world. And what can I do? What can I do? That question often starts with, what can I do to fight this? Or what can I do to stop this? But actually, how about let's make that question, well, what can I do to create this? You know? And that, to me, is what the Dharma piece is really about. So I'm going to read a little bit on Dharma as well. I first heard the word Dharma when I read about the Dharma punks in ID magazine, while I was researching feature ideas for style. Based out of LA, Noah Levine and Josh Corder were a pair of tattooed former punk rockers preaching meditation and other teachings from Buddhist philosophy as an aid to addiction recovery. This was way before my Numinous awakening, but still I was deeply intrigued since my spirit or intuition evidently recognized a pair of absolute soul brothers. But not having heard of Dharma before, I simply added it to the list of mystical-sounding words that lived in the file in my brain marked to be investigated one day, along with words like Shakti and Mandala. Since Dharma rhymed with karma, maybe it was something to do with destiny. It wasn't until my friend Naomi wrote a piece for the Numinous about Dharma that I gave the concept much more thought. But reading her take on it, I realized that doing your Dharma is about answering your soul's calling. And even better, it encapsulates the idea that in doing so, your work will automatically be contributing to the greater good. The concept of Dharma appears with varying subtleties and meaning throughout different strands of Eastern religion. For Sikhs, the word Dharma means the path of righteousness. The Hindus see it as the right way of living, leading to universal harmony. In Buddhism, meanwhile, it gets stripped right back, with Dharma simply describing a sense of cosmic law and order. My favorite definition, not least since it was becoming increasingly clear that all the Numinous practices I found so compelling were actually in service of bringing each individual human soul back into alignment with this cosmic code. Take astrology, for example. If, as my friends the Astro Twins put it, your birth chart is like a blueprint for your soul journey, then learning about the strengths, weaknesses, and challenges of your chart and really making your life choices in accordance with this information, living as your absolute authentic self, will naturally lead you to do the work you were born for. And by the law of Dharma, this work will also, in some way, be of help or service to others. And so, yeah, I think that what I liked so much about the fact that people have really resonated with this chapter is that it shows there's a real hunger and a desire to contribute and to participate in some way, rather than blindly sort of consuming whatever it is that we're kind of, whether it's the path that we've sort of gone down to satisfy others, whether it's the products and services that we're just taking because it's what's there. I think that, like I said, we're in a really interesting moment in history where we have the tools, the Aquarian tools, to be able to create our own path, you know, the tools to create our own businesses, but also to access information about ourselves and what we're here to do. And I think that kind of inquiry is extremely exciting and extremely promising in light of the difficulties we may sometimes feel that we're facing. I was really debating whether to include chapters on yoga and meditation, because I feel like there's so much out there at the moment about these practices, and what could I possibly say that isn't being said a million times in a million listicles on Mind, Body, Green? And but I decided I wanted to include these, and they were more personal chapters, I suppose, about my own journey with both these practices, which I suppose with both of them I kind of embarked on as I guess I should do yoga, I guess I should meditate because that's what everyone's doing now. And so I talk about my journey really with both these practices, and actually how it's been, with so many things, tapping into the really big why that really fully inspired me to embrace both yoga and meditation in my life. So I'm going to read a little bit from the chapter on meditation, which actually became one of my favorite chapters, despite the fact I kind of wrote it because I felt like I should write it. But this is just from the end, really, and it's kind of talking about what I see as the big picture conversation around the meditation revolution, it could be said, is unfolding right now. And I like that I've picked so many kind of like more of the deeper dive excerpts, like I said, and I love the fact that this is underneath the Sagittarius full moon. I have my rising sign as Sagittarius, which is very much the philosopher's sign, and it really is this kind of moment in the astrological calendar, the Sag full moon, to kind of take that zoom out and think about the kind of like big picture perspective. So this section is actually called The Big Picture and the Big Fish. So, even better, meditation is also good for us, as in the human race, and the planet that we inhabit. When I asked my meditation teacher, Bob Roth, who's the CEO of the David Lynch Foundation, amazing man, if he ever comes to speak here, do not hesitate to come and hear him speak, he's incredible. And when I asked Bob what he thought the world would look like if everybody meditated, he told me, if even 1% of the population learned to meditate, as well as less stress and disease, there would be less divisiveness and less violence. There would be more consensus and willingness to work together and be collaborative, which is a whole lot bigger than the answer I was expecting, and one that speaks to the role of meditation in the global shift in consciousness that's the hallmark of now-age thinking. On a more micro level, here's how Bob has seen this at work when people begin to meditate in families and other community settings. When a family meditates, everybody becomes more accepting of differences, and so everybody gets along. When I'm feeling good and confident about myself, it doesn't matter if somebody likes a different style of music or has a different opinion to me. Meditation facilitates this because, as David Lynch writes in Catching the Big Fish, his book about transcendental meditation, the thing with meditation is you become more and more you, more and more connected to your higher self, that is. Lynch also writes about transcendental meditation as being a way to access the ocean of pure consciousness known as the unified field, a mystical concept the ancient Vedic scholars of India spoke about as the origin of all living things, including thoughts and ideas. Lynch's big fish are the ideas you have to dive deepest into the unified field to catch. Time for another great Einstein quote. I think 99 times and find nothing. I stop thinking, swim in silence, and the truth comes to me. And there's more insight into the cosmic element of being human in my favorite TED talk ever by Jill Bolt Taylor, a brain scientist who suffered a devastating stroke and was able to use the experience to gain living, breathing insight into how the brain actually works. Since the stroke occurred in the left side of her brain, the side that rules logical thinking, she proceeded to observe as all left brain functions, anything relating to the ability to process information, shut down one by one, leaving her to experience life from an entirely right brain perspective, or it could be said, from deep within the unified field. Her most profound insight: I am an energy being connected to the energy all around me through the consciousness of the right hemisphere of my brain. We are energy beings connected to one another through the consciousness of our right hemispheres as one human family. We are the life force power of the universe. The implication of millions of people getting on board with this idea that we are, in essence, all connected by this universal self. In terms of the impact that this could have on the stage, think about what Bob Roth said. Less divisiveness, less violence, more consensus and willingness to work together and be collaborative. And so there we go, big picture of meditation. And I love the fact that the David Lynch Foundation have actually just opened a new office in Washington and have active plans to really speak very directly to the political community about bringing meditation practices into politics, which I think is a very exciting development. Seriously, Bob Roth, amazing man. So I've got two other short excerpts I want to read for you. This one I haven't been reading it very much, but I was invited to speak at a dinner last night that was all about plant-based living and the importance of plants, really, and kind of embracing a more plant-based diet, I suppose. And that's something that has been a part of my spiritual journey. And I kind of go spiritual like this because my idea of spirituality, I suppose, like I said, is not really founded in any sort of religious philosophy or background. It's really simply a case of feeling more connected to my spirit. And when I talk about my spirit, it's really just my sense of aliveness or inspiration. That's it. And so for me, a spiritual practice is any practice that connects me to that sense of aliveness, my most inspired, alive, excited, enthusiastic self, you know? So a spiritual practice for me could be an amazing, honest, open conversation with a dear friend, as much as it could be a really deep meditation or, you know, a yoga session that just makes me feel like I've merged with the cosmos. So yeah, when I talk about spirituality, I'm kind of coming from that perspective, really. But yes, so for me, eating more and more plant-based has become a spiritual practice too, but for the simple fact that eating that way, my body functions better, I have more energy, I feel more alive, I'm therefore more connected to my spirit. But beyond that, also, as I mentioned in the chapter on meditation, having identified the connection to this spiritual self and having intellectually come to understand that we're all connected by that spiritual self, then it really has made me question all of my choices and how they impact other beings, other animals, as much as other human beings. And so for me, it becomes a natural sort of, well, of course I want to eat plants, not animals, because, yeah, harming animals is harming myself. I mean, it's interesting as well. I haven't really studied many of the I haven't read any of the kind of traditional spiritual or self-help books. I've just happened to have come to many of the same realizations that are within them through my own experiences. So anyway, I read this piece last night from the chapter called Feeling the Plant Medicine Peer Pressure. Because the next sort of part, I suppose, of the plant-based living conversation is about plant medicine. So I'll read a little bit here. So if every social movement has its drug, then the substance fueling the seekers of the now age is plant medicine. The catch-all term for ayahuasca, peyote, San Pedro, and ibogaine, a vine, 2 kinds of cacti, and an African shrub, respectively. Used throughout history by indigenous shamans, these mind-expanding, heart-opening, and often hallucinogenic plants are thought to bring spiritual healing to whoever imbibes of them, being a fast and effective way to access a deep shamanic trance. Practitioners believe that this is because the plants themselves have wisdom to share with us, that they are messengers of the cosmic universal energy that connects all living things. We can also include marijuana and magic mushrooms here, I guess, since they're also plants, and since you hear about people using them medicinally in the now age too, particularly here in California. Not to mention the medical marijuana lobby gaining more traction year after year. And when considering the overall healing power of plants, it's also worth remembering that the majority of modern prescription drugs also use chemicals derived from plants. So why has plant medicine become so popular in the now age? I think there are 3 main drivers behind the upswell of interest. First, the natural, straight from Mother Earth angle fits nicely with our current all-organic, nothing-processed approach to food. Just as we've become well-versed in scanning food labels for man-made nasties, why choose lab-manufactured chemical drugs for healing or highs with all the clunky man-made side effects when there's a natural alternative? Second, the element of tradition and sacrament. Most plant medicines are taken in a ceremonial setting, like the one described earlier in the chapter, and are based on ancient shamanic teachings, creating an atmosphere of reverence and communion that taps the basic human need to connect, both to each other and to something greater than ourselves. The way society is set up now, opportunities to unite with other human beings in a meaningful, tangible way are becoming fewer and further between. And you can't get much more analog than coming together for an ancient ceremony based around a psychedelic herbal tea. And third, on a more mystical level, it feels to me like the plants themselves might just be behind this. Okay, so bear with me on this one, but what if, in a last-ditch attempt to slow down or even halt altogether the unimaginable damage we're doing to our planet, the plants have actually gotten together in their own alternate leafy reality, had a powwow, and decided that the best way forward was to gain direct access to the hearts and minds of the human populace. Oh, and P.S., is it a coincidence that I keep writing planet medicine instead of plant medicine as I'm writing this? Because more often than not, what people report after a ceremony is a feeling of deep connection to nature, a tangible sense of their place in the matrix of all life, and, as a result, a desire to make changes in their day-to-day existence that reflect this new understanding of themselves as children of the cosmos, as in heal their relationships with themselves and with others, and generally accept responsibility for their place in their community, both local and global. So yeah, a little deep dive into plant medicine, or planet medicine, as I kept saying. And I think that's the other really big, important underpinning of this book and of the work that I do. You know, we're, as much as we're at a time where we're very able to see that many of the systems that govern us and that rule our lives, or that we subscribe to in our lives, are not working for us individually, but also for our societies. The devastation that has been wreaked on the planet is obviously just, well, it's terrifying when we really think about it. And again, I think that so many of the practices in here, which might, well, okay, so I've been describing this book. I mean, look at it. It's all pink and shiny and like, yay. And it is. There's a lot of like, yay, and fun and jokes. And I've been describing it a bit as a Trojan My Little Pony. You could just... It's kind of like rainbows and glitter, and over here it's all fun and hugs. And then you get into it, and it's like, and now, guys, it's time to take responsibility and step up and pay some back rent for your place in this planet, right? I mean, that's what the Dharma piece to me, it's like doing our Dharma is like paying our rent. If we think about, I've come to think about, you know, the divine cosmic forces of creation as almost like my landlords. And actually, if I really want to inhabit a pace on this beautiful planet, then I need to take full responsibility for caring for my home, you know, as we all are becoming more and more aware. So again, big realizations I never expected when I started on this journey. So the final piece I'm going to read is actually from the conclusion. And it really talks, I guess, about exactly that, kind of coming into the final realizations of, well, what happened, the sort of transformation that I went through writing this book and embracing all of these practices. Okay, so in the intro, I said some stuff about world peace, and I kind of embarrassed myself by including such a beauty queen cliche. But what I really meant was that already I could see how following my path into the Numinous was making me kinder, more compassionate, more giving, and less self-absorbed. How seeking to truly know, accept, and forgive myself, how to unconditionally love myself, was making me way less obsessed with accumulating stuff to make me feel good. I'm way more connected to the fact that what feels really great is helping others, creating really cool shit, and in some way contributing to the greater good. Since then, yes, in the past 18 months, I've gone from thinking of the Numinous as a cool girls astrology site to seeing it as a platform for spreading this message as far and wide as I can. Based on my own journey with alcohol, which I talk about in the book at length, I've started an event series for the sober curious called Club Soda NYC, which is designed to remove some of the stigma around choosing a more sober life and to remind people just how high we can get on our own supply. I've launched Moon Club, a monthly mentoring program to aspire a new generation of seekers to become spiritual activists in their communities. And at the time of writing this, I'm organizing an initiative for World Peace Day titled Tune In, Peace Out, based on the idea that the first step towards creating more peace in our communities, our world, why not, is to seek peace within ourselves. So this is the direction my life is going in as a result of writing and reading many, many times over this book. What has revealed itself as my wider path, which is not by any means to suggest that you put it down and immediately start preaching peace, altruism, and sobriety, but also do, since that would serve my mission nicely. Thank you. But what I hope you will feel inspired to do is begin, in earnest, a thorough investigation into your truth, into your path, the path of your ultimate happiness, health, fulfillment, and empowerment, and as a result, the path of your Dharma. Not to mention have a bunch of fun, make some heartfelt new friendships, and enjoy endless adventures while you're at it. I often describe the practices and healing modalities I cover on the Numinous as the missing piece of the wellness puzzle. Because guess what? In my experience, when you clean up your diet and begin to take better care of the physical, you will automatically be asked by the universe to pay more attention to your mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and to make any necessary adjustments to your priorities accordingly. Eddie Stern, my philosopher friend, who you met in the chapter on yoga, recently wrote a piece for the Numinous about the Hindu concepts of sakala, the reality we experience with form, and nishkala, the reality that is without form. In other words, our outer quantifiable world, our body, possessions, money, social media, even the universe, and our inner unquantifiable realms, knowledge, love, compassion, dreams, hopes, and potential, the material and the mystical, the here and now and the numinous. In yoga, he wrote, knowing who we are is the solution to all misery. For when we don't know who we are limited by the external things we measure ourselves against, sakala. We measure, we compare, and we are miserable in doing so because we always come up short. Yoga teaches that when we truly know who we are immeasurable, pure consciousness, nishkala. In other words, it is seeking to know the unknowable, to connect to the truth of our numinous nature, where our unlimited potential and our true freedom lies. And if I could wish anything for you, for me, and why not for all humanity, it's for us to be free. The end. Thanks. Thank you, everybody. And that is actually the end of the book, so I've ruined it for you, sorry.
Take some questions?
Sure, I'll take some questions. Why not? If anyone has questions.
Bring your mic over here.
So, I came in a little later.
Okay.
I apologize, but I'm very much impressed by what you've accomplished and what you wrote. And I'm not playing devil's advocate. I really do think you're amazing up there.
Thank you.
And it takes a lot of bravery to go through what you have in your life. So I applaud you. With that said, I do have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of loaded, so I apologize.
They're what?
They're loaded questions.
Oh, great.
So I'm putting you on the spot.
Thanks.
But it's coming from a place of compassion and love.
Okay.
Do you think you would have had the same experiences if you don't feel comfortable answering some of these? Totally understand. Okay. Do you think
Thanks.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Okay, sure.
Do you think you would have had the same experiences if you were not influenced by your shadow self, desire for alcohol? Or do you think it was just another form of growth you needed to embrace?
Speaking specifically to my relationship with alcohol, you mean?
Yes. Because a lot of mystics become mystical as a result of some type of addiction.
Right.
Some of us are born with it and have been this way since day one.
Mm-hmm.
Others of us, and all of us are mystical,
Mm-hmm.
but most of us end up having to be thrusted into this external world, internal world, and shocked into it.
It's very interesting. I have a piece coming out on Mind, Body, Green, of all places, tomorrow. It's not a list, by the way. So I wrote a piece for Mind, Body, Green that talks about how I have many friends who are in the more traditional kind of recovery community. And I know from speaking to them and having researched these communities that many people, when they seek to recover from addictive behaviors, find a sense of spirituality. And it's in fact finding that sense of a connection to a higher power that really enables them to overcome their addictive behaviors. For me, it was the other way around. So connecting to and finding that sense of connection to myself / my greater self / the universal oneness made me really realize that my addiction, I will call it an addiction. I don't identify as an alcoholic, and I'm not in recovery.
I don't think you are.
But it made me identify, or made me very aware of the fact that my habitual drinking patterns were one of the biggest blocks to me experiencing that connection on a regular basis. And so uncovering or having these experiences actually led to me now being what I describe as sober curious. So I drink on very rare occasions, and I have through embracing, but it's been more through through seeking this connection to a deep connection to my sense of self and my sense of aliveness, as I described how I feel about spirituality, has been the impetus to really address those addictive habitual drinking patterns, which I have come to believe that a much, much larger proportion of society than would ever want to look at it that way is engaging in, actually. And so that's become a really important conversation for me, and one that I am not afraid to talk about ever. And in fact, it's a conversation I want to have as much as possible. So thank you for bringing it up.
Second question.
Okay.
Let's see. Is this book a book of mysticism, healing and nourishment, or is it a book of getting over negative self so that you could open your heart to what truly exists?
All of the above. Yeah, I mean, all of those subjects kind of are intertwined in my journey as it's presented in this book, I think. In terms of the shadow self, right. I mean, I think that I do talk about in here how society is very quick to label certain behaviors, experiences, feelings as good and bad. And a big part of my journey with doing this work has been stepping outside of that and really trying to accept all of those behaviors, feelings, activities as part of being human, you know? And I think the more that we can look at our shadow self and see it as part of ourself that needs to be embraced and supported as much as the other parts of ourself, the more we can live in wholeness and the more we can accept that in others, and the less fighting, internal and external, we'll experience in our lives. So learning to accept and acknowledge and forgive my shadow behaviors, shadow self, has been a huge part of the journey, and I think that's a huge part of all of our journeys, and I think that's playing out on the world stage right now in a very big way too. So we're being forced to look at our shadow collectively right now, and actually I think, yeah, that's a big part of the work. So how does mysticism and spirituality play into that? Well, these for me are tools for kind of like investigating those dark places, in those dark places that we can't necessarily articulate or really understand in our intellectual experience of being humans. But these, you know, the myths of the Eastern, the religious philosophies can help us kind of investigate these parts of being human, really. So yeah, it's all in here.
No, I think it's fascinating.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question is, what have you done when life has thrown you for a loop, let's say? Just me personally, just recently I went through a divorce and I'm going through it, and then I had to move because of that, and then, you know, you have these life pillars and then they kind of readjust all at one time. Mm-hmm. And I've gone further into my spiritual practices, so I just wonder what you've done when life has thrown you 2, 3, 4 curves at the same time.
Well, it kind of depends on the nature of the curveball, I suppose. I mean, I think in a funny way, and I talk about this in here as well, when I moved to New York in 2012, it was like so fabulous, right? My husband's got this great job, moving to New York, how exciting. This is like many Brits, particularly Londoners, kind of like look at New York as like the next, that's like where you want to go next. Mm-hmm. I had all these visions of like becoming Carrie Bradshaw, basically. Like literally I was going to be freelance, I was going to like wear fabulous shoes, I was going to get yellow cabs everywhere so I could always wear heels. I remember when I was like picturing my life in New York, most of it involved me standing on the corner of Fifth Avenue hailing a cab in a pair of Miu Miu shoes, right? And when I got to New York, it was one of the most difficult experiences I've ever been through, because I was removed from my family and friends, knew nobody, had my job, all the status and all the kind of like self-worth that was tied up in this like fabulous job kind of like just stripped from me. I was back at the bottom of the heap in terms of like where I was career-wise. I accepted a crate because I was so afraid of not being able to pay. So then we moved to New York, and it cost like $16,000 to move into our first apartment, because you had to pay, we had to pay like, you know, because you didn't have any credit history, it's like months rent up front, pay the agent. And I was just like, every time I went to the supermarket, the grocery store, it was like $50 for a loaf of bread and some eggs. I mean, it was just like freaking out that I didn't have a job and it was so expensive. So all of that kind of fear. And I took this ridiculous job where editing a magazine in Ibiza in Spain, and decided I was going to do 2 weeks in Ibiza, 2 weeks in New York. So I was doing this crazy commute, like constantly jet lagged, which again, on paper, kind of fabulous, but I was just more miserable than I've ever been in my life, and I felt completely uprooted. And that's really when I sort of fell into this, when I really embraced fully this path. And I think, finding, through astrology for me originally, I suppose, finding a connection or some way to explain what was going on in my life that sort of gave me a sense that this was part of a bigger plan,
Right.
has been really, really helpful. In the chapter on tarot as well, I speak to an incredible reader called Lindsay Mack, who does come out here to LA quite a lot to do residencies, and she's fantastic. She said to me, you know, the tarot is an amazing tool for really learning to understand that nothing happens to us, but everything happens for us. If we're willing to embrace, again, the shadow aspects of our experiences, the more difficult aspects of our experiences, as actually just part of our experience, and really putting each of our experiences into the category of like, it's just another part of my experience. But then having said that as well, I mean, I'm really glad he brought up the alcohol conversation, but for me, like, and I don't know your situation, whether you even drink or whatever, but for me, one of the major things in terms of feeling more, like I have a more solid sense of self-confidence and the ability to actually just overcome or withstand whatever might be happening externally that's very difficult and painful. Cutting alcohol out of my life has actually really helped me to feel so much more confident in my choices and my ability, like I said, to kind of override those ups and downs. But yeah, so many of these spiritual practices can help us find peace and healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really resonated with a lot of things you said, and I know a lot of people did as well. One of the things I'm asking is, you talked a little bit about coming out spiritual. And I know for folks like us, we live, you know, one coast and the other coast, and it's kind of easy for us because there's a lot of a community. But what about those folks who are kind of like everywhere else, where there's no Bodhi tree? You know, there's no places like the Numinous that are really around them, you know, in where they are. Like, what's your advice to them?
Well, thank God for the internet, right? This is one of the reasons we started Moon Club. Because Alexandra Roxo, who's my collaborator, who's been a writer for the site for years and has been, you know, leading ritual and ceremony since she was like 15, and is really deeply engaged in her own sort of mystical, esoteric practices and studies. We combined forces to create Moon Club because we realized that, yes, great, if you live in New York and LA and even London to an extent, there's a moon ceremony happening and there's communities of people coming together to have these kinds of conversation, and it's pretty easy to find. If you're in Tennessee, not so much, you know. If you're in Beirut, not so much. So we wanted to create a place online where people could come together and commune, and we meet weekly for virtual rituals online using Zoom webinar platform. And people can chat, and we have people live on the video, and we talk about a lot of these concepts and ideas. We have different spiritual activists come on who we interview to give people inspiration. And the other piece in that was that, again, I mean, I think it's really interesting that I'm having this conversation with you all here when there's the Goop wellness thing happening in LA today. I don't know if anyone knows about that, but Goop are doing this wellness kind of mystical wellness conference that it's $500 to $1,500 a ticket. So the other point behind Moon Club was like, even if you live in one of these cities, if you don't have $35 to go spend on a workshop, which many people don't, let's face it, then you also don't have access to this information, which is information that is like, it's our birthright, you know? It can't be kept to a privileged echelons of society. It's for everybody. And part of the message of the Numinous, and one of the reasons I wanted to make it more accessible too, is that really this is information for everybody, you know? And that's why I love what the David Lynch Foundation do. You know, they charge a lot. It costs a lot to go and study TM with them. But with those funds, they've taught they've taught TM to hundreds of thousands of veterans, to kids in underprivileged, deprived areas, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I think that, yeah, it's making it more accessible is part of the big mission, really.
Thank you.
And thank God for the internet.
Hi.
Hello.
I, until very recently, maybe the last year, had never heard of plant medicine.
Okay.
And until my daughter married someone who is a partner in a place called Rhythmia in Costa Rica.
I know that place. I
You
haven't
do?
been, but yeah, I know of it.
So I went specifically to hear Dr. Michael Beckwith from Agape.
Mm-hmm.
He was doing a seminar there. And while I was there, I thought, well, okay, I'll
Wow.
try this plant medicine. And I'm just curious about your experience with it. It was interesting because there to see Michael Beckwith, there was like the typical church lady And then I turned around, and the church lady was, getting ready to start the ceremony with us, to do plant medicine. And I thought, what an, open-minded thing for someone who is coming from a more traditional church kind of situation. But it happened to be a shaman in from Colombia, and the whole experience was like stepping into, National Geographic, and the music and the drums and just everything that happened. It was like the most incredible experience, beyond even just the plant medicine. So I'm just curious, and they're licensed to do it, but I'm wondering where you've done it, I'm assuming.
No.
Oh, you've never done it?
No.
Oh.
This is my...
Where do people do it?
Okay, so the chapter is called Feeling the Plant Medicine Peer Pressure, because it's interesting. Like, since I've embarked on this path, I'm constantly being invited to come sit in ceremony. And it's always said a little bit behind the, come do this thing, because it's actually illegal in this country still. And I have not done it, but because I've been very much aware of what responsibility comes with it. And I'm very tuned into, and this is what I talk about, my intuition, like tuning into my intuition about any and every decision, be it what I want to have for lunch, what jobs to take, to whether to do a plant medicine ceremony. It's like the number one tool, right? And so no, I haven't done it yet. I say yet, because I'm waiting to feel the call, I suppose. But I think it's incredible that, like you say, so many people who wouldn't necessarily have partaken in something like that are open-minded to it, which is where I said this thing about, like, feels like the plants are kind of getting out there and like sending the message too, because I think what's really interesting is that so many people who are doing plant medicine are CEOs of like Forbes 500 companies. They're former bankers, a lot of celebrities, like people with influence, be that, cultural influence or financial influence, which I think is really exciting. Why a place like Rhythmia, for the people who don't know, it's the first kind of like 5-star plant medicine resort in Costa Rica. So definitely worth checking out if this is an interesting... So, I mean, there's somewhere to go do it because they have a license where you can go and do these ceremonies. There's another I talk about in here. There's actually an organization based out of Holland called ICEERS. Like, that's the acronym. I'm not sure what it stands for. But it's a really... They've done funded so many studies into the different plant medicines and what they're best for treating. So that's a really great resource too that's listed in here as well.
Let me add a note there as well that at Bodhi Tree we have a journal. Bodhi Tree's one of our pillars, and we have a whole article about plant medicine that is there now. I forget the name of it. Can anybody remind me from our staff? But anyway, it's there. So if you go to the Bodhi Tree Journal, you'll see a whole piece. And just to kind of anchor what you said, this is a very personal choice. So we don't want to communicate to anybody that there's a sense of pressure or you need to do this to accomplish spiritual awareness.
Yes.
Because certainly you don't. There are many, many paths to greater spiritual awareness. Somebody had a question right here. There you go. Let me pass it to you.
Hi.
Hello.
I just had 2 quick questions. What form of meditation do you practice? I heard you mention the David Lynch Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you practice transcendental
Yes,
meditation?
I do.
And then my second question was, were there any books that you found very inspirational or that sort of like cracked you open, that sort of opened maybe another door on your spiritual path that you may recommend or that you found, very inspirational?
Well, I quote from a few books that have been very impactful for me in here. Like I said, I haven't really read many of the sort of more traditional, kind of the well-known sort of spiritual books, I suppose. I think that Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly, is actually, it might not seem a spiritual book, but for me it really, really is, because it's about, for anyone who hasn't read it, she talks about how vulnerability and embracing our vulnerability, which is essentially about embracing our feelings. And when I talk about, that connection to our spiritual self, our feelings are really how we communicate that to the world. So Brené's book on vulnerability was huge for me because it really, I'm getting much better at it, but it used to be that in situations like this, and I will just cry. And I remember having like, oh my God, I've got a book coming out. I'm going to be doing all these things, and I'm just going to be like, become known as the girl who just cries. and a kind of a sort of energy healer I know in the UK was like, that's wonderful. You're going to teach the world that it's okay to be vulnerable. I was like, no, why me? But I do think that, you know, embracing our vulnerability is actually a huge part in kind of like embracing our spirituality, because, again, it's about just really being okay with every part of ourself, our emotional self, you know. And back to the TM thing, I talk in the book, in the chapter on meditation, how it took me about 6 or 7 years of kind of trying every different kind of meditation before I came to TM. And I think the reason I resisted TM for so long is because I'd heard that TM is a practice that's 20 minutes twice a day. And to me, that was just like, well, that's only for obvious, like, that's for experts only. That's like the big kahuna. I can't even sit for 5 minutes regularly. How am I going to do 40 minutes a day? And actually, when I was like, well, if I'm going to write about meditation, I need to experience it. Went to learn, and it's the one style of meditation that I find to be the most accessible and the easiest to embrace. So, yeah, it was an interesting one. Yeah. But with TM, it's essentially Vedic meditation, so it's a mantra-based meditation. Yeah, I'd recommend it.
I'd like to jump in with a question, Ruby, about, you know, your book title is Material Girl, Mystical World. You talked about hailing a cab in your heels, you know, and that sense of materialism that so much of our society embraces. And of course, you know, you mentioned Goop is having their event today. They, I think they offer a lot of wonderful ideas and awareness, and at the same time, they celebrate a certain material view of the world.
Yes.
Take some ridicule for being ridiculously expensive.
Yes.
I just wondered in your own life how you reconcile materialism with that spiritual principle which says, I have all that I need.
Well, I think that I reconcile it by being a human being in a physical body living in the material world, as Madonna once said. You know, I talk also about how, yeah, I think there's a perception that I could perceive to be a misconception, that to embrace a sense of yourself as a spiritual being, to lead a spiritual life, that you must cut off all attachments to material things. I think that's the right path for some people, but for the majority of us, it's probably quite unattainable and actually may put people off even investigating a more spiritual side of life. If the perception, like I said, is that, well, if I'm going to identify as a spiritual person, then I must no longer desire any of these material things, it could be a major deterrent from people ever experiencing this or investigating this. I think that for me personally, it's helped me. So I think that society as it is set up within the capitalist systems that we all are forced to play into, really, there's the huge emphasis, 99.9% emphasis put on material achievement, material success. For me, embracing the spiritual practices of this path that are in this book, it's been about redressing that balance, you know, lessening the impetus or the kind of impact or the need or the desire for the material by amplifying my connection to the spiritual. Finding that balance, I think, is, as a human being operating in the material world, a healthy way to be living. But things like, you know, I still love beautiful shoes. I just don't find myself buying them or thinking about them that often because I have way more important things to be thinking about, you know, and spending my time on. This year, so I wrote a piece for Teen Vogue this year, for example, about how this year I've committed to only buying vintage and secondhand fashion. Still high fashion. This is Armani, but it's like, I don't know, vintage. As a way of kind of making a statement about the impact of the fashion industry on the environment, for example. I also talk about how I think that, you know, there's a line that someone pulled out on social media where I just said that I believe that beauty is the physical manifestation of love. And actually we find beauty, being surrounded by beautiful things is an inspiration in itself. To want to be surrounded by beautiful things is nothing to be ashamed of. It's just that when that desire is co-opted by the capitalist system that says we have to have more and we have to have new all the time, that's when it becomes perverted almost. And actually, I think to surround ourselves with beautiful things is what makes life worth living.
Well said. There's even a philosophical and historical root for what you just said about beauty in the Sophists, the original Aristotle Greek philosophers. They talk about beauty as one of the high values that we can have, because clearly things that are beautifully made, they enhance our lives, they increase our awareness, and so yes, we celebrate beauty as a value in and of itself.
Exactly.
Well said.
But it's when it becomes co-opted by.
Somebody else had a question? Got some over here. We'll come back over here.
Hi, Ruby.
Hello.
So my question for you is, so I guess we put a lot of mental blocks when we start like a new project or like the web, like the Numinous. So what was your mental block and how did you get past it? Like what was kind of the hardest part for you?
I think, is everyone going to think I'm completely weird? I think it was that thing, you know, I'd spent my entire life working in fashion magazines, had this kind of idea about what it was to be cool and successful. And the idea of starting a blog about astrology just kind of was like, oh God, everyone's going to think I'm just like this woo-woo kind of weirdo. And that's why, again, I mean, I think that part of the reason these practices have been made so fringe is because actually they're practices that help us connect to that deep sense of self and who I am, what am I here to give to the world, who I am, what do I really need to make me happy? Because a lot of the time, what I really need to make me happy isn't what people want to sell us, isn't what how people want us to live our lives, you know? So I do think that actually these tools and practices have been sidelined, consciously or not, to keep us on this path, when there's all of these different paths we could be exploring. So yeah, part of it was that, but I think a big part of it as well was about, I knew that this was very important to me. I knew that it was kind of what I really wanted to be doing with my life, and I felt even very in the early days that this was an important message to be putting out in the world. And that was intimidating, because what if I messed it up? What if it wasn't any good? Like, what if it failed? So a lot of those what ifs. And I suppose I was talking to a friend about it today, and it's something that's come up a lot actually this past week, just in various conversations. You know, the idea of when we're starting on a path that feels like it might be that thing that's like that really important, like this is it. Thinking about what we want it to be and what it could be can be enough to stop us ever starting. And actually, it's not until you start that you even really know what it could be. Because once you start, you realize it'll have a life of its own. So there's another book that I talk about in here, which is Liz Gilbert's Big Magic. I would recommend that book to anybody who's starting on she talks about it being about a creative life. And creativity, we mean you think of art, music, writing, whatever. But creativity, I mean, entrepreneurialism is creativity, like. So yeah, she's got some good insight in there as well. But I really, it comes back to just start, because then you'll realize that it's its own entity, and you're just there to kind of like guide it in whatever direction it wants to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ruby.
Hello.
I heard you mention that you were married when you moved to New York and went to New York. How have you talked or addressed about your relationship, and how has that been affected at all by the spiritual journey that you've been on? Because I know myself, going through a lot of spiritual growth and awakening and coming out of the spiritual woo-woo closet myself, that, you know, has affected my personal relationship. But for you, did it have any bearing on that, or was your husband relatively supportive in this process, or was it challenging for you?
He's referenced in the book as the Pisces. And in the nicest possible way, he's quite malleable. He's quite go with the flow. But no, I mean, he's incredible, and has sort of been with me every step of the way, and has embraced many of these practices himself now. Just not through me encouraging him to, or trying to push it down, but by literally just kind of looking at how being like leading by example, I suppose. He's just seen how some of these, he's intrigued, and he's seen how the positive impact on my life that many of these practices have had, and so he's been willing to have a go himself. I think that moving to a different country together at that moment in time really helped. if anyone's ever had the opportunity to go and live in a different city or somewhere where you didn't grow up, basically, it really does feel like a bit of a clean slate. You get to kind of reinvent yourself in a way. And I think that it coinciding with that for us, it sort of opened his mind to this new world that I was leading us both into, I suppose. But he now also doesn't drink alcohol. He now also doesn't eat meat. He recently started doing yoga every day, finally, because I introduced him to Yoga Glow, because there was no way he'd ever go to a studio. But knowing he can do it at home, he's always had a really bad back, and he was like, I might as well try this. And lo and behold, it's the one thing that's ever made his back pain better. So yeah, he's embraced many of these practices. And I said to my friend earlier, he said to me last week, he was like, you know, I really think that marrying you has probably added 10 years to my life. So yeah, probably
That's
so.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome to hear.
So yeah, I feel very fortunate that he's been so open-minded and has, you know, it hasn't caused a friction between us. But that's quite unique to our relationship too. And I know that for a lot of people, particularly with the alcohol piece, for example, if one person chooses to make a dramatic lifestyle change like that, it can be. And I think that my advice in those situations would be not to preach, not to try and make anybody change, and really to focus on doing it for yourself and not judging anybody else's choices. I think that's the really important thing.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks.
And thanks for being a bridge between the mainstream and the spiritual stream. It's important.
Yes. Okay.
So there's 5 principles of, and I'm not going to go into it because I'm not lecturing myself tonight.
Okay.
But there's 5 principles of mysticism and spirituality that are taught in the oral tradition. The first one is the principle of financial balance, financial freedom. Most people fail to recognize that. Most people are afraid of it. Because by doing that, you have true freedom and abundance. And you learn how to manifest faster than anything around you. You want something to eat, someone gives you food. You want a car, it's there by the next day. How do you embrace those principles? The first one.
The principle of...
The principle of finance.
Well, this has been a very interesting one for me recently.
Because from what I sense, you're in conflict with it. You're in conflict with it. Because because you can buy vintage Valentino that cost $10,000, and it would make a difference. And you can wear that for, say, a month, and then put those shoes up on eBay, auction it off, take your original principal, what you paid for it, and take, say, the $40,000, $50,000 for that vintage Valentino, and donate it to some type of charity that will benefit a lot more people than just my vintage.
I don't 100% understand the question. I don't have $40,000 to spend on anything.
No. I'm not.
Sadly.
I'm not saying you do. But what I'm saying is that the principle of finance, right, is simply that you can manifest whatever you desire by having your heart open to it completely. So let's say, for instance, you like vintage Valentino. You are becoming a public figure rapidly. What is stopping you from wearing vintage Valentino? Buy Valentino. And then talking to Valentino, having him donate it to you, and telling him what you want to do with it. Maybe you help Laura's house, and all of a sudden you raise $50,000 just for wearing that.
That would be fantastic. I recently had a situation. Well, not a situation, but I've been working on the Numinous for no pay, putting out free content into the world, consciousness-raising content for the past 4 years. I've written a book during that period. I've set up Club Soda, which is an event series, like I said, for the sober curious to spread that message. And we do sell tickets to that, but it's not enough to pay my rent. So in the meantime, I still do loads of journalism. So I'm working like literally 24/7 to pay my rent while I do all this other kind of like spiritual consciousness raising, Dharma work in the world, I suppose. And I recently got to a point where I was so burnt out that I had lost my sense of inspiration. And I wasn't feeling excited about anything that I was working on, all because I was spending so much time chasing $1 in order to pay my rent, right? So I recently, and this is like literally in the past 2 weeks, decided to take my foot off the gas, focus entirely on this work, and trust, as you say, that the money's going to come in, that the finance will come in to support my work. I have yet to see whether this principle works, but I am willing to trust that the universe will support me in this work. Okay. Thank you.
So we actually have a couple questions from the folks online, and
Okay.
one of them is, how do you select a mantra?
Oh, for the transcendental meditation?
Yeah, for transcendental meditation.
Well, with transcendental meditation, your mantra is given to you by your teacher. This is why you were taught one-on-one with a teacher. They give you the mantra whispered into your ear. You never see this word written down. And the reason they say they do it like this is because the mantra, the word, has to have no meaning for you whatsoever. If it's a word that you can attach meaning to, then your mind it's something for your mind to grab onto and create more thoughts around. If it's a completely meaningless sound, then it becomes something that can transport. The word mantra means mind vehicle. So it's a word or a sound that transports or removes your mind from your consciousness, or separates your consciousness from your thinking mind. So yeah, your mantra is given to you in transcendental meditation.
And then in terms of astrology, besides just looking at sun sign astrology, which I know probably a lot of us in the room are familiar with, what is another aspect of astrology, say maybe the moon sign or even north or south node, which I know you mentioned in your book briefly, that folks could look at to really get more of a deeper insight as to why they're here and how they can better serve their
Well,
dharma?
I'm really, really fascinated with moon sign astrology, and it's one of the reasons we started Moon Club, to draw more attention to that part of ourselves. The sun represents our essence, the essence of our being, our get up and going, our kind of like actions in the world. The moon represents our emotional life, our numinous life. It's the inner, internal stuff. And so I'm an Aries sun, and as much as I can relate to this sort of like entrepreneurial, want to do things my way, attributes of the Aries sun, I'm not necessarily that self-confident. I'm not necessarily combative, like I'm all these other kind of things that I don't relate to. And growing up as a kid, I remember being like, Aries are meant to be really confident and quite sort of like to fight and get in arguments, and I'm not like that at all. I'm actually really shy, and I love to read books and just kind of like think.
What's your moon?
My moon is in Cancer. So it's actually quite a difficult placement, because that's, I cry at the drop of a hat. I'm like super emotional. And yet have this Aries sun that's like, no, go on, go out there, be the leader, do it first. It's going, which I write about my experience at the Burning Man festival. My Cancer moon didn't enjoy Burning Man at all. No. So the moon sign is, I find it, but also the Cancer is ruled by the moon. So it kind of makes sense that I'm especially interested in moon sign astrology. But I think that your Mercury sign can be very interesting. We live in such a communication age, and Mercury is the planet of communication. So, but I mean, every aspect of astrology is fascinating to me. There's so much you can learn about yourself just from looking at one planet placement,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, well, thank you all, and thank you, Ruby. This is Ruby Warrington.
Thanks, everybody.
The book is Material Girl, Mystical World. It is available here at the Bodhi Tree from our shop. It is available online at bodhitree.com. We want to thank you so much for being here. I really, really enjoyed what you had to say.
Thank